Peter Varghese, I'm the Chancellor of the University of Queensland. I've held that position for the last 3 years. Apart from that, I'm a superannuated public servant. I had 38 years in the Australian public service, mainly in foreign affairs, trade and intelligence. So a wonderful, interesting, lucky career.
You arrived in Australia in 1964 as an 8-year-old with your Indian parents, in fact from Africa, if I remember correctly.
From Kenya.
From Kenya. At a time when Australia still had a white Australia policy, what do you remember about that time?
Oh, it was a very white country. I mean, in 1964, there were very few people of Asian background in Australia, extraordinarily few with an Indian background. So we had 2 years in Newcastle, and then we moved up to Brisbane in 1966. You could virtually gather the Indian community in Brisbane in our family home, and indeed Mum and Dad often did.
Was it a racist Australia?
I didn't actually experience it as a racist Australia, although being a student of Australian history, I'm very conscious of where race fits into Australia's sense of itself historically and its identity. And as one historian said, probably the single most important factor in the forging of Australian nationalism. My personal experience was a bit different. I mean, I could count on one hand the number of times that I felt I had experienced racial discrimination. It may have been an unusual experience for the Australia of that time. I think there were two reasons for that. One is English was our mother tongue. My parents took a decision very early that they would bring their children up to speak English first and other languages second. The other is that we came from a Catholic background, and so as soon as we arrived in Australia, we in a sense were plugged into a part of the Australian community through the Catholic Church. But what all of that did reinforce in my mind, although I didn't think of this as an 80-year-old, was that Australia is a highly assimilationist culture. And while multiculturalism has become the sort of leitmotif of how we describe the country, I think at its heart, those who are successful in Australia are those that assimilate into Australia. And I think there's an expectation in the broader community that people who come to make Australia their home are welcome, but there is an expectation that they will assimilate.
Is that a fair expectation, a right expectation? In fact, many people argue that the language changed in Australia. It was about multiculturalism, and then it changed to assimilation.
Well, I think the language has certainly changed, went through a very strong period where multiculturalism was an end in itself, if you like. I think that always masked a deeper instinct in the Australian community, which was essentially assimilationist. Is it fair? Well, I think it's a reality of Australia. I don't think it's inconsistent with people coming to Australia and retaining many features of their cultural identity, whether it's language or food or a way of life. But I think the idea that you can find unity in multiculturalism per se is probably a hope that triumphs over realism.
Does it mean that you can only keep part of your cultural heritage? And I'm referring here to, for example, diversity in the workplace. Does it mean that you have to change your natural approach? You have to be more vocal? You have to behave in a way that may not be natural?
Well, I think in any workplace you have to deal with what comes naturally, and you have to deal with what you have to do to succeed in your job. So you need to be comfortable in your skin, but you can't live only in your comfort zone. And this isn't a comment about multiculturalism. I think that's a comment about leadership more than anything else. I mean, leaders do have to force themselves to do things that don't come naturally to them, and good leaders will reflect on that and work out a way to do it while remaining authentic, as they say, in their leadership style.
Is there a risk, though, that when you talk about assimilation and also the value of diversity, one waters down the other?
To an extent, it probably does. I think the great value of diversity is a diversity of worldviews, a diversity in the way in which you think about issues, coming to issues from different angles. That, to me, is the real value add of diversity. Unfortunately, along the way, we've tended to reduce diversity to ticking boxes, whether it's a gender box or a multicultural box or some other box. Now, all of those things can influence your worldview, but it's not the core thing that gives value to the concept of diversity.
Do you think that is understood today?
I think it's becoming more understood, and I think it's important that it's framed in that way, because otherwise I think we will see a backlash against the concept of diversity by people who think it's just another version of political correctness, or something that you have to pretend to be agreeing to in order to get on with things. But understanding the real value of diversity, I think, is central to the success of organisations, business, government, any walk of life, I think.
Which brings me to my next question. Do you think Australia is a country where discrimination is alive and well?
Well, I think you could never say that discrimination doesn't exist in Australia, but the thing that struck me about Australia is here is a country whose historical baggage has been unequivocally racist. If you look at the White Australia policy, if you look at the early policies and practices towards Aboriginals, and yet I can think of no other country in the world where at the individual level people take you for who you are. I think that's a huge strength of Australian multiculturalism, that people are prepared to take you for who you are, rather
That's
than
not necessarily borne out in the statistics, though, is it? There are numerous surveys where people say they've been discriminated against, Asian Australians in particular, and also in the statistics around leadership positions. Some 12% of Australians identify as Asian Australian, and yet they make up just 1.6% of senior leadership positions.
Yeah, I'm not saying that discrimination doesn't exist. I think it does exist. I mean, that famous study where job applicants went out with Anglo-sounding names and then with names that weren't Anglo. I mean, that tells you something. I think in all organisations there is an instinct to clone. I think a lot of people tend to select on the basis of a self-image and wanting to replicate a self-image. So I think, as those processes work their way through organisations, you will find barriers. I'm not in any sense arguing that they aren't barriers, but do I think Australia in 2019 is a fundamentally racist society? My answer would be no. Do I think Australia in 2019 will embrace multiculturalism to such an extent that it'll abandon assimilation? No, I don't, because I think that's the track Australia is comfortable with.
So essentially, to be blunt, play by our rules, play our game, and you'll be okay.
Up to a point. Up to a point, I think that's right. Now, I think the bandwidth of the rules is expanding. In other words, what our rules are, I think, has a much wider interpretation now than there would have in the 1960s when I came to Australia. But I think if you stray too far from what Australians would see as their core values, then they will be, I think, a problem.